Thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for joining Literacy is the Key Boosting Our Economy. And we are simply thrilled to have our guests and our author of our study, Governor Jeb Bush and Dr. Jonathan Rothwell. Welcome to all of our guests, our friends, the panelists, donors, and even family. Thank you for being here. We're very excited this morning to launch really a seminal study, something that has not been done before really in the field of literacy. And we can't think of two better folks to discuss this topic that's so important to all of us as citizens here in the US, as well as to our economy. With that, on behalf of the Barbara Bush Foundation, the staff and the board, really this work is born out of our commitment to continue the life and the work and the legacy of Barbara Bush. And she simply said, if more people could read, write, and comprehend, we would be that much closer to solving so many of our problems plaguing our society. And that is so true. In fact, she knew then, 30 years ago, she knew in 1989, that it is truly the key to a life of opportunity, of equity, and prosperity for all. And that's why just a few weeks after she arrived in the White House, she formed the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. Over 3 decades, the Barbara has supported family literacy in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. We remain committed to her vision of working towards an America where everyone can read, write, and comprehend so they can navigate their lives with dignity. And dignity is the key, and that's what she believed in for all Americans. Unfortunately, 31 years after all of her hard work and all of her energy and all of her effort, sadly, it is still a silent crisis today in America. It is ignored, it has been historically underfunded and under-researched, despite being what we believe and what she believed is a solvable problem. And we want to talk about how do we solve this problem, hopefully once and for all in these next few years. That's why for us at the Foundation, our key focus, our key part of our strategy is building the collective knowledge base to document literacy's impact on our society, every aspect of it. And that's why we wanted to commission this study with Gallup and with Dr. Rothwell. We believe that it's a part of the solution to the crises, particularly as we face current challenges around the global pandemic and the economic uncertainty that we currently face. We hope today to aim to inform more people, engage more people about the issue, to document its broader connections to health, to low literacy, to voting, to jobs, and the dignity of work. That's what Barbara Bush believed. And we hope you will join us. We hope that you will continue the journey with us over the next 30 years. We hope that this study and discussion moves from being just an individual response to a societal response. We know that literacy is an economic and an equity issue. And we also know that this study translates literally into dollars and cents. Those dollars and cents that the entire field has known for 30 years and that Barbara Bush knew all along. That if folks are fully participating in our society, meaning that they are fully equipped to be able to participate as parents and workers and citizens. Simply put, we really want to move from a sympathy argument to what I call an equity argument, or more eloquently, the president of the Ford Foundation states it as such. Darren Walker says, we have to move from generosity to justice. Quote, as I see it, there's a spectrum of giving that goes from generosity to justice. And while all actions we take along that path can benefit people, the closer we move towards justice, the more likely we are to benefit society as a whole and for the long term. In fact, the benefits of tying literacy to GDP, the dignity of work, is exactly what we want to talk about today. And before we get started, let me just give you a couple of footnotes so that you understand the discussion that we'll be having with the governor and with Dr. Rothwell. It's very important we understand, what do we mean by literacy? What do we mean by literacy levels? It's quite technical. So for those of you joining us, we want to kind of break that down into very simple lay terms. First and foremost, when we speak about level one and below means a non-reader up to 2nd grade level. Level 2 means 3rd to 5th grade level. Level 3, 6th to 8th grade level. So please keep those notes in mind. With that, I am honored to introduce the 43rd governor of the state of Florida. Governor Bush, thank you for being with us. He has a strong focus on literacy during his 2 terms in office. He was very committed to the issue. In fact, he's a former honorary chair of the foundation, and he worked very closely with his mother on her life's work. He also served alongside his sister, Dora Bush Cook, who is currently our honorary chair. Governor Bush, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, British. It is a joy to be with you. And Jonathan, thank you for this great work. I love the idea of moving the conversation towards the equity issue, because the world we're moving towards, the world we're in right now, requires people to be literate. There's no other way. I mean, in the haves and have-nots, you can break down society all sorts of ways. But the one solvable issue that we can really focus on is making sure that every kid can read, and making sure that every adult has access to literacy-based courses in the most, in the best fashion for them. That should be a national priority, executed probably at the local level, but it needs to be a national priority. So putting an economic spin on this, I think, is really important.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Dr. Rothwell, pleased to have you as our author and principal economist at Gallup. And Dr. Rothwell is also a visiting scholar at George Washington University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's also a contributor to the New York Times and a recent author of the book, A Republic of Equals, a Manifesto for a Just Society. Dr. Rothwell, welcome.
Thank you very much, British. It's great to be with you both.
Great. Well, I will kick off our conversation and discussion today with Governor Bush. I'm going to turn back to you again. Governor, literacy was enormously important to you and to your mother. It's been such a significant part of your work. Could you just share a few thoughts with us why literacy matters so much to you and to your mother, but also it was such a key focus during your public service, but also now after you've left office. Additionally, maybe speak a bit, and I think you started with that this morning, why you think this study will help advance your mother's cause. Governor?
Sure. Well, I was inspired by my mom for all sorts of reasons, but particularly the love of reading and its importance for everybody. There's really kind of 2 tracks here. The Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy focuses on adult literacy. The first teachers of our children are parents, and if parents can't read, it's hard to imagine how successful they'll be as that first teacher. They can love their child with their heart and soul, but if they can't help them in the earliest years get a joy of reading because they can't read or read to them, you can see how the gaps grow. As governor, I focused on what happens to a 4-year-old or an entering kindergartner. What are the gaps there? And the gaps are enormous. The gaps start out at such an early age. And if we really want a just society, a society based on equity, we should assure that every young person, every 4-year-old can graduate from pre-K to go to kindergarten, having the basics down. And so as governor, we were way back behind we were in the bottom of the pile as it related to outcomes in this regard. So we implemented universal pre-K. Every child gets a half day's worth of literacy-based pre-K for 4-year-olds. I think we're the only state that implemented that. And then we created a strategy that said at the end of 3rd grade, every kid has to be able to go to 4th grade as beyond a below basic reader, grade level reader. If not, they have to develop, the schools have to develop strategies either in summer school or holding a kid back to be able to do that. So not just, we ended this, we created this gate, a no social promotion gate, and we were serious about it, but then we developed strategies to train teachers how to teach reading. We put reading coaches in every school. We created the largest mentoring program to help struggling 3rd graders be able to be successful. We made it a state priority, and Florida went from literally the bottom of the pack as measured by the 4th grade NAEP tests, the nation's report card. We were 29th out of 31 in 1997, and 10 years later, we were 4th out of 50. And low-income kids in Florida led the way. And it was because we put this command focus on early childhood literacy as a priority. It seems to me is if we made that a generation-long commitment, we could eradicate illiteracy in this country, and we could deal with the economic gaps that start growing at an early age. But when you're an adult and you can't read, think of the lack of access to opportunity that exists. And so this is a long-term struggle for sure. We're in a world of immediate gratification. This is not one of those places for immediate gratification. But if we stick with it, I think we can achieve great things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's well said, Governor. And, you know, I say to folks often, you know, mama can't read, baby can't read. And so you have to, that's where your mother was so brilliant. It's family literacy. We've got to break that multi-generational cycle of poverty, which is tied and correlated to these other social problems that she spoke so eloquently about 30 years ago. It's inextricably linked. And we know, as you rightfully articulated, that we have to put a priority on this, but also the value of this. And I think that value and those benefits directly correlate to the study and the information that Dr. Rothwell has worked on with us. And so with that, I turn to you, Jonathan. Governor Bush eloquently mentioned the economic benefits, the societal benefits, that value piece that I was just speaking of. Please, let's take a bit of a step back and have you walk us through your research and your findings. And what do those benefits look like? Let's break those down in economic terms, because I think Governor Bush set you up so beautifully. And what were those findings, and why do they matter to you as an economist? But also, again, going to that equity argument, why should it matter to all of us? Why should we all care? Jonathan?
Well, it's a great question, and the governor did set it up beautifully. So it's been well established in economic literature going back centuries, really. Even Adam Smith had the idea that skills are related to how much income you can earn, how productive individuals are, how productive nations are. And skills are often proxied through educational attainment. But we know that educational attainment is actually not as good a measure of skill as the sort of literacy that's being measured and evaluated on cognitive exams, whether it's done at done through schools, or in the case of the data that was used for this project, done by an OECD created assessment called the PIAC, or Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And the PIAC is essentially the adult version of the more famous PISA tests that are given to 15-year-olds all around the world. And this was given to a random sample of adults, 5,000 in the first wave in the United States, and over 20 other countries. And they have well-evaluated, validated assessments of not only literacy but numeracy. And literacy was the focus, obviously, of this study. And what the results show is that basically 54% of adults don't meet that benchmark for proficiency that you described as being basically a 5th grade level or below. They're not even getting up to the 6th grade level. And when you have such a large percentage of the population that is struggling to understand complex texts, not able to read and fully comprehend nuanced news stories or public health information, you have a number of real problems. And it plays out in the labor market in ways that I think many people would expect, that there's systematic differences in the incomes of people who have lower levels of literacy compared to those with higher levels of literacy. And I'm just going to show a slide real quick from our database here that illustrates that point. So hopefully you can see this. This is just a graph showing that at 0, let me see if I can make it bigger here. Sorry about that. Slideshow. This shows that at the 0 to 1 levels of literacy, people are making $34,000 on average in the United States using 2020 dollars. If you move people up just to level 2, so that's not even the 6th grade reading level as you characterize it, they're already jumping up to 47,596 on average. And then if you can get them to level 3, then it's it's over $60,000. So there's a huge jump from going from 0 to 1 at the level to all the way up to level 3, and that's basically eradicating illiteracy for that group. And then if you do the same for the level 2 group, you're talking about 54% of the U.S. adult population. And as you might guess, that adds up to a lot of money. And I estimate that it adds up to $2.2 trillion in additional income, which means additional GDP, because GDP is measured essentially as the sum of income. One way that the Bureau of Economic Analysis measures GDP, there are a couple different methods, is by taking everybody's income in the economy and pulling it together. And so this would be a direct enrichment of the economy by $2.2 trillion if we eradicated illiteracy. Of course, it assumes other things are the same. It's kind of a rough back of the envelope calculation because we don't know for sure what the labor market's going to look like if we made such a dramatic change to people's skills and literacy. But I think it's actually maybe even a potential underestimate, because with rising literacy, we'd also see increased entrepreneurship, increased innovation and invention. So I think it's actually a conservative assumption to assume that the labor market and earnings potential would be the same. I think it might, in fact, be one greater.
No, it's remarkable of how much we could be losing or gaining, as it were. And to that end, Jonathan, I think the additional point is, as the governor sort of set up, literacy is tied to, jobs, stable income, et cetera. There are various factors that sort of play into poverty or low income situations. And all the way from, does somebody have a library in their home, to are they experiencing food insecurity or poor health outcomes, particularly as we're dealing with COVID at the moment. Can you speak to these? And in particular, I think there's always been this conversation or discussion around, does being poor cause low literacy, or does low literacy cause poverty? And how are they sort of linked? And I think you looked at this a bit in the study, and there's some historical factors that I think would be helpful for folks to understand.
Right. So there's certainly some complex relationships when you're talking about the effects of poverty and childhood development, and how that ties into education and literacy. What we do know is that childhood poverty creates obstacles to education in several ways, but they can be overcome. So the obstacles include limited access to time spent with a literate parent, as you and the governor have alluded to, who can then successfully teach their children, pass on knowledge and read to the child, obviously. And then we also know that in this country there's limited access to high quality educational opportunities through the school systems. We live in a highly segregated nation by both income and race, and that and other factors mean that there's a diversity of opportunities in terms of accessing high quality school opportunities and getting the best teachers to the children who need them the most. And so poverty is tied into that because it limits those opportunities. But at the same time, we've figured out, and the world has figured out, how to overcome these kinds of obstacles. And we've seen this in history. When if people think on watching this think it's too optimistic or bold to assume that illiteracy could be eradicated, just consider the fact that in the 18th century, very few people in England and the United States could read because of the public school opportunities and the public funding of education. England and other rich countries were able to essentially eradicate the worst forms of illiteracy, and we had the Industrial Revolution follow from that. And likewise, we've seen in our own country, when we ended slavery, there was a strong Reconstruction movement that involved setting up new schools for the newly freed slaves and their children. And in the South, according to census data, literacy was at 17% in 1870 in the Black community, and it went up to 71% in 1910. So just from 40 years, there's just tremendous gain in literacy. And it was even, and literacy was even higher in the North, 96%, and for the Black community, because they weren't burdened by the Jim Crow system. And so we've done widespread mass literacy campaigns before, and proven that they can be, highly effective. So I think it's not too much to think that we can aim for a society that where every child has the opportunity to learn to read and write at a high level.
Governor Bush, if I can ask you to jump in on that, because I think what you started the morning with is ways we need to do that. Love your additional thoughts around this question.
Well, I think it's a defeatist idea that people can't rise up.
That's right.
Circumstances are so overwhelming that life is just the way it is, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I hear more and more of that. We're in a deeply pessimistic period of history right now for our country, and I think we need to shed that and be optimistic, but realize that this, you got to have dogged determination to move the needle in an area this complex, but it can be done. I mean, look at Jonathan brought up some interesting examples in our own country, but think about Korea. In 1950, it was one of the poorest, if not the poorest country in the world, devastated by the Korean War. Illiteracy rates were astronomical. And today, basically, South Korea has 100% literacy. Mm-hmm. And it's a first world country. And so in a period of 70 years, I think driven by their command focus on making sure that every child is educated, it's a cultural value in Korea as much as it is a economic issue. Families understand that their children have to be successful in life. They have to be not just functionally literate, but they have to master much more difficult work than what we expect here in our own country. And so I think there is a path forward on this. The other issue that it's not just the $2.2 trillion of additional economic activity and rising income for people. It also has huge implications, I think, if you see people earning more money because they've garnered that the power of learning to read. It lessens the demands on government. It enhances. You can look at issues like public health, dieting. All these things come together to create a much more prosperous America, and one where people can pursue their dreams as they see fit and not be dependent upon government. And so there's lots of reasons why this should be a national priority. We spend more money per person in this country on healthcare than any country in the world, and yet our outcomes aren't that good. We have a growing divide as it relates to income. There's a significant increase in people in the upper middle class, but there's also a declining middle class. The bottom quintiles are growing, and the top is growing as well. And it seems to me that we need to find ways to deal with that equity issue. And one of the things that has to be done, I think, is make a command focus on family literacy, as well as having high expectations for every kid in our K-12 system, rather than dumbing it all down to the point where we feel good about where we stand, but we're really not achieving the results we need.
I think, right. And I think that's important. Jonathan, maybe pick up on that vis-a-vis economic gains, and those gains that then translate into these other issues that the governor's speaking to. So you found that there could be significant gains if we focus, as the governor said, on this problem sort of collectively at the local level, at the state level. Can you describe specifically your results around those economic gains and what I would call the spillover effect, so we can see those better health outcomes? So as governor said, as we can see kids reading on grade level, their parents are in better jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So could you speak to those gains and then how it varies, Jonathan, across states? And we know that some locales or some metropolitan statistical areas could actually, those that are almost in the poorest quintile half of the country with a lot of these measurements that we've been talking about, in fact, could benefit even more than some of our large cities. Could you speak to this part of the study? I think it's very critical information for for mayors, for governors, for policy leaders, and quite frankly, even for folks who are, I like to say, boots on the ground, for our peers in the field of literacy who are toiling away to support these parents to make a better life for themselves. Speak to those gains and the spillover effect and the difference between various locales across the country.
Sure. So in some parts of the country, the gains to literacy would be as high as 16% of GDP, and that's in states, predominantly in states that have both low levels of literacy currently and have great economic opportunities for people with high levels of literacy. And so that a lot of those states, as this map that I'm sharing shows, happen to be in the South.
Mm-hmm.
But also extending out to California, which obviously has a large immigrant population that coming from Central and South America that may not have strong English literacy skills to start with. So when you have pockets, large pockets of people who don't have a mastery of literacy, you have great opportunities for gains, obviously. And then the other thing to take into account are the cities and metropolitan areas and even some rural counties where there are high-paying jobs for people that have skills. And those skills don't necessarily entail getting a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. They could be oil drilling. It could be in Texas or Louisiana. It could be installation repair work where the literacy skill is reading and mastering a technical manual and being able to apply that in complex situations. All the way up to obviously the highest paid professional jobs that our economy offers in law and medicine and running organizations. So unleashing literacy will have different effects around the country. But it's going to be impactful everywhere, but especially in those places where that tend to be in the South, but found throughout the country, where you have diverse populations, where literacy is not particularly high, but there's a fair amount of economic opportunity. So, for example, a black woman living in Chicago who has a high level of literacy is going to earn tens of thousands of dollars more than her neighbor who has low levels of literacy. Likewise, a white man living in rural Arkansas is going to have opportunities to earn $10,000 to $20,000 a year on average, more than his neighbor, who has a low level of literacy. So there's a role for first of all, every level of government that has to be involved in this. It's obviously not just a federal problem, particularly since our schools are controlled in large part by local governments. But the gains are to be had everywhere throughout the country.
Yeah. And Jonathan, maybe to follow on in this current situation of COVID, 100-year pandemic, who knew we would be living through this? Talk about a little bit of, so there are these potential gains, but also kind of what we're dealing with now. How is COVID and this public health crisis, affected literacy, economic outcomes, health outcomes? Do we have any data around that currently, and how we have to sort of factor that into to sort of where we are in space and time, even with the gains that you've spoken about?
We do have some compelling preliminary data on how literacy is relating to COVID. Gallup has been tracking most important COVID-related behaviors and attitudes really since the start of the pandemic in early March. And we see striking differences in compliance with public health guidelines for those with higher levels of education, which we know is linked to higher levels of literacy. So everything from social distancing to mask wearing and concern and fears about the pandemic are all significantly higher with those with higher levels of education. And we know that compliance really matters in terms of curbing the spread of the virus and ultimately saving lives and of course having those benefits on the economy when city governments can move to a more accommodating phase of the pandemic and allow more businesses to reopen and allow restaurants to reopen with certain restrictions in place once the disease is tamed somewhat, and then hopefully we can all kind of hang on at that low level of infection until we have a vaccine. But literacy is playing a huge role in already in how successfully we're managing this.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great segue. Governor, back to you. Given the current reality, and you've been speaking to this, whether it's the pandemic or kind of this way we're living today, states across this country are going to be, governors, mayors are going to be they're already in quite a situation. They're facing cuts, low taxes coming in, a real struggle on top of the pandemic, and significant budget cuts we know are coming in the months ahead. Can you share your thoughts or thinking with your peers and colleagues, governors, mayors, folks that are grappling with budgets at the state and local level? How should they or can they prioritize literacy? Why should they prioritize it over other maybe competing interests? Do you have any advice for them around this topic?
I have talked to a few governors about making sure that they fund their priorities first. It's a tendency to fund whatever we've been spending it on, and then no new initiatives because there's not money. And I would suggest this is the time, in times of great disruption, it's a time to challenge every aspect of what you do and ask the following question: if we weren't doing it this way, how would we do it? And what should the priorities be? And I can't think of a priority more important than adult family literacy, as well as literacy for the youngest that are just starting out. And it's important because the pandemic has proven that whatever the trends were prior to, say, February, whatever the trend lines were in our society in January, February, they've been accelerated. They've accelerated to the point where you can see that people are going to be functionally obsolete in our society and our economy. The acceleration of artificial intelligence and mining big data and robotics, all of these things are wiping out huge swaths of jobs that exist. And yet at the same time, we have 6 million, at least prior to the pandemic, we had 6 million jobs that go wanting because people don't have the skills. We have this massive skills gap with a societal change that is moving at warp speed. And look, if you can work from home and you have access to a device and access to the internet, just like I am right here, this is going to be a good time. But if you don't have access to the internet and you can't read and you have low reading skills and your job has been wiped out, that gives you the first rung on the ladder, what are you going to do? So to me, this is in the post-COVID world, we need to focus on these huge gaps that start with reading, and then they move towards the other indicators that Jonathan has so eloquently brought out in terms of income and the ability to live a purposeful life. So fund the priorities first should be the answer, and challenge how you do things so that you can do more with less, because it is going to be a difficult time. I don't want to just be Pollyannish about this. These next several years are going to be really difficult for municipalities and states for sure. Now, Washington has the advantage that they don't have balanced budgets. They just spend whatever they want. But the rest of us, have to live within our means, and that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, I'm going to just throw something to you, just to pick up on what the governor was saying around, jobs that were vacant, thousands of jobs were vacant. We couldn't fill them, from Amazon to Whole Foods, they were saying, we've got all these jobs, we can't fill them. And a lot of that we believe is tied to some of these literacy levels that we've been talking about. But Jonathan, there was a piece yesterday in the Wall Street Journal on productivity and college, how many people we need to get in college and this sort of thing. Could you speak a little to this? We've put so much attention on college level education and getting people through college, but somehow our society, the market in some ways, is telling us, maybe someone wants to to go to culinary school, or they want to do a trade, or what have you. Maybe speak a little bit about the juxtaposition about this huge emphasis on that higher level education, but yet maybe we're not actually, we put all these people through college, but maybe we're still not as literate as we need to be. As the governor said earlier, you've got almost 100% literacy rates in parts of Africa and South Korea, but we're still struggling to go to that lower end of educational attainment because we're looking only at college, and somehow you're a failure if you don't go to college. Could you speak to that, Jonathan? Because I think that's important. Sure. Even though it's not part of the study, it tracks with this study and this overall current situation that we're talking about.
Absolutely. So that, a few, just contextual facts that it's still the case, as many, no doubt listening, believe that you can earn quite a bit more if you have a bachelor's degree than if you have a high school diploma on average. And that gap has grown since about 1980. It's grown fairly steadily, though in the last, really in the 21st century, income gains for those with a bachelor's degree have started to flatten out. And it's been even worse for those with a high school diploma or less. But that has led some to speculate that maybe we're overproducing people with college degrees, that sort of thing. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that there's maybe too much emphasis on the credential and not enough emphasis on the skills underlying it. Mm-hmm. And we've seen strong evidence for that. I published a piece on the Brookings Institution website a few years ago, documenting the fact that the generation born around 1980 achieved peak literacy in the United States, measured by long-term kinds of exams, including one done by the National Assessment of Education Progress. We can also see it in PIAC data if you compare people of different age groups, cohorts across the PIAC. People born after 1980 started to do a bit worse, but the long-term trend was up, and then it kind of looped down. And we've seen a little bit of that around the world. So it's not unique to the United States, but it's been worse in the United States than it has in other OECD countries. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think one, there's maybe some evidence that what people are doing outside of the classroom isn't as cognitively stimulating as it used to be. There's been some compelling evidence that TV, for example, if you're watching sort of junk television, discourages people from reading and otherwise enhancing their literacy skills. But I think we also have to worry about the quality of the education that people are getting at all levels. And there's been a rise in people going to college for-profit schools that are online, and you really worry about the quality of those experiences. Our own polling data of alumni shows that those schools tend to be rated very low by their alumni, and they're much less likely to recommend that other people go to those sorts of schools. And yet that's where most of the growth has been. The Ivy Leagues and our top most selective colleges haven't been rapidly expanding to accommodate the larger populations. Most of our top schools were built in the 19th century, and so we need to think more creatively about what high school looks like, and then what beyond high school looks like. There are a lot of jobs, including technical jobs in computers and technology, that don't actually require a bachelor's degree. They don't require reading. They don't require literacy. They don't require literature. They don't require English classes or Greek classes, but they do require a high level of literacy to understand the technical material. And so if people aren't armed with that bedrock foundation and being able to write well and interpret well complex texts, they're not going to succeed. They're not going to be able to teach themselves the latest computer programming language. They're not going to be able to read a manual for how to assemble an oil rig, or there's a whole range of opportunities that people are missing out on for lack of literacy. And I think we have maybe had too much emphasis on credentials as the indicator of whether someone's prepared to contribute to the economy, and not enough on what they actually know.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Governor, would you like to pick up on that and perhaps offer some closing remarks? And I have one last question for you and Jonathan as well.
Yeah, I think we should be a little more aspirational in our country these days. This is a time to lift our spirits up. I've always believed in BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals, and I think governors ought to have as an audacious goal that every student graduates from high school, college, and or career ready, that they have the basic skills to be able to, and have earned perhaps college credit before they finish high school, and perhaps a credential that says that they're on the path to being able to fill this 6 million person skills gap that exists. The other aspiration ought to be that you graduate at 4 years in a 4-year university. You can do it in 4 years. We measure full-time equivalent students for 12 credit hours now instead of 15, and we measure degree completion in 6 years instead of 4, and it's all paid for with recourse debt on the backs of students. This might have worked in the 20th century. It doesn't work now, and this is the time to disrupt how we educate. And the measurement of a university's success ought to be how many people they can educate rather than how many people don't get in. It's a strange process, but universities brag about the number of kids that can't get into their universities. The final thing I'd say is we have a ton of people, as this study suggests, that have already gone through. They can't go back to school. They're struggling maybe, but they're not going to go back to K-12 for sure, and they may not be able to access education. And they may be in a prison, or they may be in a dead-end job, and that we, as a national priority, I think part of our aspiration ought to be that we're a country of second chances. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to give people second chances, having a command focus on literacy for adults has to be part of that answer.
Amen, Governor. Amen. Jonathan, final closing thoughts or anything in the study that you want to draw out or pick up on the governor's points?
Well, a big theme of the way I kind of think about the world as it relates to these topics, when I expressed in my book that you kindly referenced in the intro, is that people really well, let me put it this way. In a just society, people have the opportunity to do what they do best. And that comes right. That's an idea that you can be found in Plato. It can be found in the liberal philosopher John Rawls. I think it's a natural outgrowth of an idea of reciprocity and even the golden rule. And so when we have large numbers of people who are given no opportunity to really develop their natural talents and abilities and fully participate in society, whether as a worker, a citizen, or in any capacity, we can't really say that we're a just society. And so this has to be an aspiration, as you eloquently put it in your reference to the Ford Foundation, Derek Walker's statement. Fixing those problems of injustice and structural issues are really is really the most transformative thing we can do. When we get those things right, the details and a lot of the problems that we have really become much more manageable. And so I completely agree with what you and the governor have said about making this a real priority.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So one last question for both of you, and I'll start with the governor. Governor Bush, what was the last book you read?
Unfortunately, I'm reading 4 books right now, but the last book I completed is Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley. And it's an amazing book because I think it's taken her years to write it, but it's about why some people do well in crisis, emergencies, storms, 9/11, why some people do well and why others don't. And it is a profoundly interesting book in the midst of a pandemic, for sure. She's a great writer.
Great. Hopefully some folks will grab it. Jonathan, how about yourself?
I'm reading a book called Know Your Price by my friend and colleague Andre Perry, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And it's such a timely book. It's about it's organized around his extraordinary life. He grew up in a home in Pittsburgh with a large number of children who were not his biological brothers or sisters, who are cared for by a woman in the community who is evidently one of the greatest caretakers the world has known. She raised children from the poorest families in Pittsburgh, and many of them have gone on to have illustrious careers, including Andre. And yet the neighbors who lived just doors down the street, many ended up in jail or struggling in many profound ways. And Andre tells that story, but he ties it into his goal, which is to reevaluate how we think about Black people and Black communities in this country, and recognize the strengths and not focus exclusively on the weaknesses, which we tend to do in public policy discussions. And I think it's just such a timely message given the nation's efforts to grapple with the ongoing injustices that Black community faces in this country. So I highly recommend it.
Great, thank you. Well, before I say thank you to you both, I think this has been a very insightful and terrific conversation, and we are so grateful for your time. And as Barbara Bush so beautifully said, literacy is everyone's business, period. And I think our discussion today has clearly highlighted that. We also want to let you know about upcoming webinars. We have one on September 30th with Jeb's sister, our honorary chair, Dora Bush Cook. And on October 13th, I'm pleased to let you know we'll be have another webinar with John Meacham, speaking of our current racial unrest, his book around about John Lewis. So we're super excited about that. And for more information on Jonathan's study and our recent Forbes article that came out today, please visit our website at barbarabush.org. Governor Bush, an honor and always wonderful to see you and speak with you. Thank you for your time. Dr. Rothwell, we thank you for your seminal work. We look forward to continuing to work with you. And thank you to all of you who joined us this morning. Have a wonderful day and wonderful rest of your week.